Karen refuses to pay parking fee because she was only inside for 7 minutes. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The indoor parking structure of the bustling shopping mall was typically filled with the sounds of vehicles moving through the aisles, the screeching of tires, and the occasional beep of a car's backup sensors. On this particular Saturday afternoon, the lot was more crowded than usual, with families and shoppers coming and going, eager to take advantage of the weekend sales. In one of the far corners of the parking garage, a sleek, black sedan slowly coasted toward the exit. The car's driver, Karen, was already fuming. Her patience had worn thin as she maneuvered through the crowded lot in search of an empty spot. Now, after only a brief stop in the mall to buy a few items, she was ready to leave. She had spent a grand total of 7 minutes inside, and in her mind, that was more than enough to justify the idea that she shouldn't have to pay for parking at all. Karen was no stranger to parking garage disputes. She had long held the belief that the mall's parking fees were excessive, an unjustified charge for what she considered to be a minor inconvenience. After all, she was a paying customer, wasn't she? She had made a purchase, which, in her logic, should have granted her the privilege of free parking. 7 minutes, just 7 minutes, was hardly worth the $10 charge, in her opinion. It was an insult. As her car neared the exit gate, she could already see the large, illuminated sign flashing the fee, the one that reminded drivers to have their payment ready. But Karen had no intention of paying it. Not today. Not for 7 minutes of shopping. As she pulled up to the gate, she glanced at the parking ticket she had taken upon entering, her eyes narrowing at the number printed on it. She had parked her car, gone inside, and came back out almost immediately. To her, that time in the mall was nothing more than a quick errand. In her mind, her visit barely qualified as a legitimate parking experience. She was convinced that the system was taking advantage of people like her, making money off of short, harmless visits. She wasn't going to stand for it. When she pressed the button to pay at the automated kiosk, the system displayed the amount she owed, $10. It felt like a slap in the face. Karen's jaw clenched, and for a moment, she just stared at the screen, as if willing the number to change. Her eyes darted to the gate, which remained firmly closed, waiting for her to either pay or go back through the entire parking structure again to seek an exit without a fee. She could already hear the other cars behind her, likely annoyed at the delay she was causing. But to Karen, it didn't matter. She was not paying for parking when she had been inside for such a short time. This was a matter of principle. With a dramatic sigh, Karen slammed the car into park and threw the gearshift into neutral. She wasn't about to waste another second on this automated nonsense. Instead of paying, she pressed the horn. A sharp, angry honk echoed through the parking garage, startling the drivers around her. The sound bounced off the concrete walls, amplifying the frustration in her every note. She honked again, this time holding it down longer, sending a clear message that she wasn't moving. In her mind, this was the start of a protest, a way to demand the attention she felt she was entitled to. She rolled down the window and shouted toward the small booth at the entrance. "Hey," she called out, her voice rising in irritation. "This is ridiculous. I've only been in there for 7 minutes. I'm not paying for that." A young attendant, who had been calmly answering questions from other drivers, turned her attention toward Karen. The attendant's eyes widened slightly, clearly surprised by the outburst, but she maintained her professional composure as she approached the gate. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but the system doesn't differentiate between short visits and long stays. You need to pay the full fee," she explained, her tone polite but firm. Karen, however, was having none of it. "No, no, no," she snapped, her voice growing more intense. "I was inside for 7 minutes. This should be free. This is an outrage. I want a manager. I want someone with authority." Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white as she honked the horn one more time, as though summoning some higher power to resolve her perceived injustice. The sound echoed once again, louder this time, cutting through the stillness of the garage. The attendant, clearly caught off guard by Karen's escalating behavior, quickly radioed for the manager. "One moment, please, ma'am. I'm calling the manager over," she said, trying to de-escalate the situation as best as she could. Karen didn't take well to being told to wait. She continued to honk, leaning on the horn for several seconds, her anger building with each passing moment. "This is ridiculous. I can't believe this is happening," she yelled, as if the entire parking garage system were personally designed to inconvenience her. "You can't charge me for such a short time. I'm not paying." Her voice, now tinged with a sense of righteous indignation, rang out across the structure. She turned to glance at the cars behind her, the annoyed drivers shifting in their seats and tapping their hands on their steering wheels, waiting for her to either pay or move along. Karen, of course, took no notice of the mounting frustration around her. A few moments later, the manager arrived. He was a middle-aged man, wearing a crisp uniform and a name tag that read Kevin. Kevin walked toward Karen's vehicle with a purposeful stride, his face neutral but firm, already prepared for the conflict ahead. "Ma'am, I understand there's an issue with your payment," he began, his tone steady, offering the type of customer service that was professional but far from conciliatory. "I've been informed that you're refusing to pay the parking fee. Is that correct?" Karen, her arms crossed over her chest, shot him an angry look. "Yes, it's correct," she exclaimed, her voice rising. "I've only been inside for 7 minutes. That should be free. I refuse to pay for that. I demand that you open the gate and let me out without paying." Kevin didn't budge. He knew from experience that some people would argue endlessly over parking fees, but he had a job to do, and he wasn't going to let a customer walk all over him. He stood his ground, taking a deep breath. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but the fees are standard, no matter how long you've been parked. The system doesn't allow for exceptions. I can't waive the fee." Karen, not getting the response she had hoped for, leaned forward in her seat, her anger boiling over. "This is outrageous," she shouted, pressing the horn again, louder this time. The sound bounced off the concrete walls, an almost comical punctuation to her escalating demands. "I want to speak to someone who has the power to fix this. I'm not paying. Open the gate." Kevin's patience was wearing thin, but he maintained his professionalism. "Ma'am, the system is automated, and I don't have the authority to override it. If you refuse to pay, I'll have to call security to assist you further." He held up his hand in a motion of finality, signaling that the situation was at an impasse. Karen, her face flushed with anger, stared at him, her hands gripping the steering wheel as though trying to force the gate open with sheer willpower. She honked one last time, her eyes fixed on Kevin with a mixture of disbelief and contempt. "You'll regret this," she yelled as she threw her car into reverse, her tires screeching as she attempted to leave the parking garage. But as she backed up, the gate remained closed, stubbornly refusing to budge. Karen was stuck. Karen's frustration grew with every passing second, each moment feeling more like an eternity as she stared at the unmoving gate, the automated system mocking her helplessness with its silent refusal to open. She had spent a total of 7 minutes inside the mall, 7 minutes that she was convinced should have justified her not having to pay a dime. It wasn't like she had stayed for hours or used the parking garage as a convenience to avoid public transportation for the whole day. No, this was a quick in-and-out visit, and the fee felt like nothing more than a greedy ploy to make money off of unsuspecting customers like her. She slammed her hand onto the horn again, the sharp blast reverberating through the parking garage, amplifying her indignation. It was as if the entire world needed to hear her displeasure, and Karen was more than happy to oblige. Her actions were purposeful, intended to make a scene, to draw attention, and, if possible, to intimidate someone into doing what she wanted. The cars behind her had already started to pile up, the drivers unable to move because of her refusal to budge. Karen paid no attention to them. She was entirely consumed by her belief that this was unfair, that she should not be treated like just another customer who had to pay for parking, regardless of the short duration of her visit. Her mind raced through all the ways in which she was right, and she was certain that anyone with even a modicum of common sense would agree with her. In her view, she had already spent more than enough time dealing with the inconvenience of driving through the lot, finding a spot, walking inside, purchasing her items, and now having to wait at the gate to pay. It was all so trivial to her that paying a $10 fee for something that barely counted as a visit felt like an absurdity. Karen's eyes darted toward the attendant booth, which was now manned by a young woman who was clearly taken aback by the situation. The young woman had her hands on the edge of the counter, watching Karen with a look of nervous uncertainty. Her brow furrowed as she tried to make sense of Karen's actions. The whole scenario was escalating quickly, and the attendant clearly wasn't prepared for such an aggressive confrontation. Karen saw the fear in the young woman's eyes and seized the opportunity to push even harder, thinking that perhaps a show of strength, of commanding presence, would force someone to take her seriously. "You need to get someone with authority down here, right now," Karen shouted across the garage, her voice carrying through the air, demanding to be heard. "I'm not going to sit here all day for a $10 charge when I was only in there for a fraction of the time. It's outrageous, and I want it fixed immediately." The young attendant hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure of how to respond. She took a deep breath and then quietly picked up her radio, speaking into it in a soft, almost apologetic tone. "I'll call the manager to come down," she said, doing her best to remain calm, even though Karen's forceful behavior was clearly unsettling her. As the attendant turned to make the call, Karen's hand was still pressing the horn, her impatience growing as each second dragged on. She wanted results, and she wanted them fast. She wasn't interested in waiting or hearing the polite explanations of a parking structure she felt had wronged her. What she wanted was to be let through, with no cost, and she wasn't going to leave until that happened. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the manager arrived. Kevin, the parking garage manager, was a middle-aged man who had dealt with countless difficult customers over the years, but there was something different about Karen's approach. He could tell that she wasn't just upset, she was demanding, expecting immediate results. He approached her car calmly but with the authority of someone used to handling these kinds of situations. His demeanor was professional, but there was a subtle hint of annoyance in his eyes, one that suggested he knew he was about to be drawn into a confrontation that would require more than just diplomacy to resolve. He stood at the driver's side window, his hands folded in front of him, his posture open but firm. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Kevin began, his voice steady, offering a greeting in hopes of calming the situation before it escalated any further. "I'm the manager here. I understand there's an issue with the parking fee, and I'd like to see if we can resolve this quickly." He glanced at the ticket on the dashboard and then back to Karen, who was glaring at him with a mixture of contempt and frustration. "I'm glad you're finally here," Karen snapped, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "This is an absolute joke. I've been waiting here for way too long, and you're charging me for parking when I've only been inside for 7 minutes. That's completely unreasonable, and I'm not paying for it." She gestured vaguely to the gate as if the entire situation were beneath her. "It's a ripoff, and I won't stand for it." Kevin took a step closer, keeping his voice even. "I understand you're upset, ma'am, but the parking fees are set by the mall's management, and unfortunately, we don't have the ability to waive or adjust them for individual cases. The system doesn't distinguish between short visits or long stays, it just calculates the parking fee based on the duration you've been in the lot. I'm afraid you'll have to pay the fee if you want to exit." Karen's expression twisted into something between disbelief and outrage. She leaned forward, nearly pressing her face to the steering wheel. "That's not acceptable," she yelled, her voice escalating. "I spent 7 minutes inside. 7 minutes. Why should I be charged for that? It's practically nothing. You can't charge someone for a brief stop like that. It's not right." She threw her hands up in the air, as if her gesture would somehow emphasize the ridiculousness of the situation. "I want to speak to someone higher up. Someone who has the authority to fix this immediately." Kevin's patience was starting to wear thin. He had dealt with customers like this before, people who couldn't accept the rules because they felt personally wronged by them. He wasn't about to let Karen's unreasonable demands dictate the terms of the situation. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but as I said, the fees are set, and we can't make exceptions. If you'd like, I can direct you to customer service, where they can review your case further, but I can't bypass the system for you." Customer service? Karen sneered. Are you kidding me? This is insane. I don't have time for that. I just want to leave, and you're making this as difficult as possible. Her hands clenched the steering wheel, her fingers white from the force, and she let out a frustrated sigh. I am not paying for something I didn't even use. This is theft. Kevin stood his ground, refusing to engage further in the shouting match that was developing. Ma'am, if you refuse to pay the parking fee, I'll have to call security to escort you out of the garage, he said, his voice now colder and more resolute. The system won't let you through without payment, and I'm afraid there's nothing I can do to override it. Karen's face turned red with anger, her eyes flashing as she stared at him. You'll regret this, she muttered under her breath, throwing her car into reverse and slamming the gas pedal in a dramatic motion, as though hoping the force of her actions would somehow make the gate magically open. But it didn't. The gate remained firmly shut, the barrier still in place, mocking her every attempt to bypass it. Frustrated and unwilling to back down, Karen slammed her hands onto the horn again, the shrill sound echoing through the concrete walls of the parking garage. The situation had reached a stalemate, with neither side willing to give in. The clock was ticking, and Karen's anger was only mounting as her hopes of a free exit continued to slip further out of reach. Karen's anger reached its boiling point as she continued to press the horn, each blast echoing through the parking garage like a personal protest against what she saw as an unfair system. She had never felt more wronged in her life, and every second that ticked by, every moment the gate remained firmly shut, only fueled her frustration. She couldn't understand why no one was willing to see things from her perspective. She had been inside the mall for less time than it took to get a coffee, and yet here she was, being treated as if she had been parked for hours. It wasn't right, and in her mind, it was an injustice that needed to be rectified immediately. The fact that the system couldn't differentiate between a 7-minute visit and an all-day stay only added to her mounting sense of betrayal. She leaned back in her seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as she glared at Kevin, the manager, who stood firm beside her car. Her fingers still gripped the steering wheel, her nails digging into the leather as if she could force the gate to open through sheer willpower. You have no idea what this is like, do you? She asked through gritted teeth, her voice dripping with disdain. You probably just sit back there in your little booth and think everything is fine, but you don't get it. I've been in there for 7 minutes, and I'm being charged $10. $10 for what? A few steps around a store. That's all this is. She shook her head in disbelief, as if the very idea of paying for such a short time was laughable. It's highway robbery. It's extortion. I'm not paying for something I didn't use. This is an abuse of power. Kevin, who had remained calm throughout the entire ordeal, could feel the tension in the air growing thick. It was clear that Karen wasn't going to listen to reason, no matter how many times he explained the policy. He had been in customer service long enough to know when he was dealing with someone who was simply unwilling to accept reality, and it was becoming apparent that no amount of talking would change Karen's mind. His voice remained steady as he responded, though the weight of the situation was starting to wear on him. Ma'am, I understand that you're frustrated. But the parking charges are set by the mall, and there's nothing I can do to change that. It's a policy that applies to everyone, whether they're here for 10 minutes or 10 hours. I can't override the system, and I'm afraid you'll need to pay the fee to exit. Karen was not having it. Her eyes narrowed, and her grip on the steering wheel tightened even further, her knuckles now white with the force of her frustration. I don't care about your policies, she snapped, her voice rising again. Policies are for people who don't have any common sense. You're just hiding behind some rule that doesn't even make sense. 7 minutes. You're telling me I'm supposed to pay for 7 minutes? She threw her hands up in the air, the motion an exaggerated display of her disbelief. This is a scam, and you're part of it. You should be ashamed of yourself. I bet you've done this to a lot of people. Charging them for a few minutes like they've been parked all day. You should be ashamed. Kevin tried his best to remain composed, but the barrage of Karen's words was starting to take its toll. He had been in this line of work long enough to know that no matter how much he explained, no matter how reasonable his responses, some people simply wouldn't listen. It wasn't just about the money, it was about control, about getting their way in a situation that they couldn't accept as it was. And Karen, it seemed, was one of those people. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset," Kevin said, his voice firm but measured. "But I'm not going to engage in a shouting match. You've been given a clear explanation of the parking charges, and unless you're willing to pay the fee, I'm afraid there's nothing more I can do. If you refuse to pay, I'll have to call security to assist with your exit." Karen's face turned crimson with anger. Her mouth hung open as though she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. "Call security," she repeated incredulously. "You've got to be kidding me. I've been polite, I've been reasonable, and you're going to call security on me? You think I'm just going to let you get away with this?" Her voice had taken on a shrill, almost hysterical quality as she spoke, each word punctuated by an exaggerated emphasis that betrayed her inability to accept the situation. She leaned forward in her seat, her eyes locked onto Kevin's with a glare that could have melted steel. "You want to call security? Fine. Do it. But you're going to regret it. I'll make sure your mall gets a review it will never forget. This is not over." Kevin stood his ground, not flinching as Karen continued her tirade. He was well aware of the kind of people he was dealing with, and he had learned over time not to take it personally. People like Karen thrived on chaos, on drama, and he knew that if he let himself get caught up in her storm, it would only make things worse. "Ma'am, I'm not interested in making this worse than it already is," he said calmly. "If you're not willing to pay the fee, I will have to call security to assist you in exiting the garage. That's the next step. You're free to stay here as long as you want, but the gate won't open until the fee is paid." Karen's eyes flared with indignation, and she slammed her foot on the accelerator, the engine roaring in protest as the car jerked forward a few feet, only to hit the immovable barrier again. The gate remained shut, as it had before, refusing to yield to her demands. She gritted her teeth and muttered something under her breath, her rage bubbling over like a boiling pot. "I can't believe this," she seethed. "I'm not paying. You're all in on this. You just want to make money off people like me. Well, I'm not going to let it happen. I'll stand here all day before I pay for this garbage." She threw the car into reverse once again, hitting the accelerator harder this time, her face red with fury. The sound of the engine revving in protest seemed to echo through the garage, but the gate didn't budge. She honked the horn again, louder and longer, her impatience and anger rising to a fever pitch. She was so consumed by her sense of injustice, by her refusal to accept that the rules applied to everyone, that she couldn't see the absurdity of her actions. To her, it wasn't about the $10, it was about making sure she was not treated like just another customer. She would make her stand, and she would make sure that everyone around her knew that she was right, that she was the one who deserved to have the power in this situation. As the minutes ticked by, Karen remained stuck in place, her hand still gripping the wheel, her foot pressed firmly on the horn. The cars behind her had begun to honk in frustration, but Karen refused to move. She wasn't about to be ignored, not this time. She wasn't going to pay. And she wasn't going anywhere until the gate was open, and she had won. But in her obstinate refusal to accept the situation, she had lost sight of the one thing she should have been focusing on, the fact that she was only prolonging the inevitable. The gate would not open until she paid, and her refusal to accept that simple fact was now holding up everyone else around her. The parking garage, once filled with the sounds of cars moving, now felt eerily still except for Karen's incessant honking. The other drivers had begun to grow impatient, their eyes fixed on her car with varying degrees of irritation, yet none of them dared to speak up. They had learned that confronting Karen rarely led to resolution, in fact, it often made things worse. Behind her, a long line of cars had built up, each driver trapped in their own silent frustration, unable to move forward, their patience tested by the absurdity of the situation. Karen, however, was oblivious to it all. She was consumed by her outrage, fixated on one simple idea: she was right, and everyone else was wrong. The manager had told her the rules were clear, and yet she still could not accept the fact that the system, as inconvenient as it seemed, was not designed with her personal preferences in mind. Kevin, the manager, stood at a distance, his arms folded across his chest, watching Karen's escalating behavior with a mix of exhaustion and resignation. He had been patient, calm, and reasonable, but it was clear now that Karen was intent on prolonging the standoff. He had offered solutions, explained the rules, and even suggested calling security, but nothing had worked. Karen had dug in her heels, unwilling to compromise, determined to make a scene until she got what she wanted. Kevin glanced at his watch, noting that the minutes had stretched on far longer than necessary. The rest of the garage, once a busy, bustling hub of shoppers and visitors, had now become a battleground. "Ma'am, I'm asking you one last time," Kevin called out, his voice steady but tinged with the weariness of someone who had dealt with this for far too long. "If you refuse to pay, I'm going to have to call security. This can't continue like this. You're holding up the entire garage." Karen's eyes flashed with anger, her hands tightening on the steering wheel. She shot a venomous look in Kevin's direction before turning her attention back to the unmoving gate, the force of her gaze as if she could will it to open just by sheer willpower. Her foot pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine of her car roaring as though she was trying to force the system into compliance. The gate remained motionless, a barrier that would not yield, no matter how much force or anger she applied. Karen's frustration reached its peak, and with a final, almost defiant honk of the horn, she slammed her car into park, her breathing shallow as she seethed in the silence that followed. Kevin watched her for a moment, trying to gauge whether there was any chance of resolving the situation without escalating it further. It had become clear that she wasn't going to back down, but neither could he. His job was to manage the garage, to enforce the policies, and to keep the operation running smoothly. The longer this dragged on, the more it disrupted the entire system. His gaze flickered to the other cars lined up behind Karen, the drivers looking increasingly frustrated, some tapping their steering wheels impatiently, others shaking their heads in disbelief. He could feel the weight of their collective impatience bearing down on him, but Karen seemed entirely oblivious to the growing tension around her. At that moment, the first security guard arrived, walking briskly toward Karen's vehicle. The guard was a tall man in his late 30s, with a no-nonsense demeanor. He had seen this kind of situation before, though he couldn't recall a time it had gone on this long. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to move your vehicle," the security guard said, his tone polite but firm. "You're causing a significant backup, and this garage needs to function efficiently." Karen's eyes locked onto the guard with a venomous glare. "I'm not moving," she spat. "I'm not paying. This is ridiculous. I've been inside for 7 minutes. I refuse to pay for something so small." She gestured toward the booth and then the gate, her anger boiling over once more. "This entire system is a scam, and I'm not going to let it happen." The security guard stood still, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, you're holding up traffic, and I can't allow this to continue. If you refuse to pay, I'll have to call for a tow. This situation needs to be resolved now." The words hit Karen like a blow. A tow? The mere suggestion of it caused her heart to race with anxiety, but she was still unwilling to give up. She couldn't let this go. She couldn't be forced to accept something that felt so fundamentally unfair. "You can't tow me. This is illegal. You can't just take my car for something as trivial as 7 minutes of parking," she yelled, her voice rising to a level that echoed through the concrete walls. The security guard, unfazed by her outburst, raised his radio and spoke calmly into it. "We need a tow truck at exit 12, immediate assistance required." He then turned back to Karen, his demeanor unshaken. "You have 2 options, pay the fee or have your vehicle towed. I'm giving you one last chance to resolve this without further escalation." Karen's face turned pale as the reality of the situation began to set in. The thought of her car being towed, of being forced to deal with the repercussions of her refusal to pay, hit her harder than anything else had. But even then, she refused to give in. She wasn't about to let this man or the system win. Not now. Not when she felt so wronged. "I won't pay." "You can't make me," she shouted, her voice trembling with the intensity of her emotion. The security guard, his patience clearly wearing thin, took a step back and motioned to Kevin, who had been watching the exchange quietly from the side. "Ma'am, if you refuse to move, we'll have to take further action. This is your last warning." Karen looked around wildly, as if searching for an escape or some way to turn the tide in her favor. The sight of the other cars waiting behind her only added to her mounting sense of injustice. They were watching, silently judging her every move. She could feel their eyes on her, their impatience palpable, but she wasn't going to let that influence her. She had to be strong. She had to make a stand. "I'm not paying for this," she muttered under her breath, her voice shaking with a mixture of fury and helplessness. "This is wrong. This is theft." Kevin, seeing that the situation was at a breaking point, stepped forward again, his voice firm and final. "Ma'am, the tow truck is on its way. If you don't pay the fee or move your car, your vehicle will be towed." For a moment, Karen remained frozen, her mind racing as she tried to come to terms with the impending consequences of her actions. She glanced at the tow truck pulling up, the large vehicle's engine rumbling in the distance, and suddenly the weight of the situation hit her in full force. The cost of the tow, the inconvenience, the humiliation, it was all far worse than the parking fee. She had tried to fight, tried to force the system to bend to her will, but now it was clear that she had lost. The realization stung. With a final, defeated glance at the gate, Karen slowly turned off her car and took a deep breath. She reached into her bag and pulled out the cash, her movements slow and deliberate. As she handed it over to Kevin, she muttered under her breath, "I'll be leaving a complaint about this." Kevin took the money without a word, his face unreadable. As the gate finally lifted, allowing Karen to leave, she drove out of the parking garage, her eyes still burning with anger, her sense of injustice lingering. She had lost the battle, but in her mind, the war wasn't over. She would make sure everyone knew about her experience, about how she had been wronged. The system had won this time, but Karen wasn't about to let go of her indignation. She would find a way to make her voice heard, and somehow, she still believed she had been in the right. As Karen's car disappeared from view, the other drivers began to slowly move forward, their relief palpable. Kevin and the security guard exchanged a glance, both silently acknowledging the absurdity of the situation, but knowing that sometimes, no matter how much patience you have, some people just can't be reasoned with. The garage slowly returned to its usual hum, but the echo of Karen's protest would linger in the air for a while longer.